Greetings, quiet contemplators of darker human nature. Tonight we explore chilling cults, terrifying systems ensnaring minds, dismantling lives, sometimes with horrific ends. From isolated compounds to utopian nightmares, we uncover control's seductive power and blind faith's dire costs. This history is unsettling. If this journey captures you, gently like and subscribe. It helps our quiet expeditions as we descend. Comment your location and time. A somber global connection, dim lights. Blanket closer. Let's ease into tonight's terrifying, yet quietly told, history. Welcome back as we quietly explore history's unsettling corners. Tonight we seek to understand what makes a cult truly terrifying, moving beyond merely unconventional beliefs. Many groups hold unique views without causing harm. Our focus is on those that cross a line into dangerous control, systematically dismantling autonomy and inflicting tangible harm. It's not strange rituals that define our subjects, but the inherent capacity to warp and destroy lives, creating a high-stakes environment where the potential for tragedy becomes alarmingly real. This destructive potential forms the core of our unsettling inquiry. At the heart of such groups is an absolute authoritarian leader, often charismatic, demanding unquestioning obedience as the sole arbiter of truth and reality for their followers. To cement control, members are typically isolated, physically in remote compounds or through demanding schedules, and socially by severing ties with family and outside information. This engineered isolation breeds dependency and creates an echo chamber where the leader's narrative becomes the only reality. Critical thought is suppressed, and even extreme beliefs are normalized, fiercely defended by those trapped within the group's confining embrace, their connection to the former world carefully severed. Once enveloped, members almost invariably face systematic exploitation. Financial exploitation is a common thread, where individuals are pressured or mandated to surrender all savings, property, and future earnings to the leader or the group. This is often framed as a spiritual sacrifice or a necessary contribution to a supposedly noble, world-changing cause. Labor exploitation is also rampant. Followers may be coerced into working grueling, endless hours for little or no personal recompense, their exhaustive efforts enriching the leadership while they themselves might live in abject poverty, their toil disguised as a path to spiritual enlightenment or a vital component of the group's survival and grand mission. Beyond material deprivation, more insidious forms of exploitation target the very core of personhood. Sexual exploitation, particularly by leaders claiming special privileges or divine mandates, has been a tragically recurrent theme, often facilitated by layers of psychological coercion, where true consent is impossible within the extreme power imbalance. The individual's worth becomes tied entirely to their utility to the group or its leader. Personal boundaries are systematically dismantled, their intrinsic human dignity and early casualty, their sense of self relentlessly eroded to serve the cult's hidden or explicit agenda, leaving them vulnerable and dependent. The psychological manipulation employed is often subtle initially, then progressively more intense. New recruits might experience love bombing, an overwhelming display of affection and acceptance, which quickly becomes conditional upon their increasing conformity to the group's norms. Indoctrination into the belief system is constant, utilizing repetitive tasks, chanting, sleep deprivation, and carefully managed diets. These techniques are designed to break down critical thinking, induce heightened suggestibility, and forge a new cult identity, making members deeply receptive to the leader's pervasive control and directives. A defining characteristic of many terrifying cults is their propensity for internal coercion and violence, often masked as discipline or purification. Perceived infractions against the group's myriad rules, however minor, can be met with extreme psychological torment, public shaming, or brutal physical abuse. This creates an atmosphere of constant fear and vigilance, ensuring compliance and further isolating members who dare not trust one another. The leader's authority is thus maintained not just by charisma, but by the implicit or explicit threat of severe punishment for any deviation from the prescribed path, however arbitrary that path may seem. This internal control can tragically escalate to external violence or group self-destruction. An us versus them worldview, meticulously cultivated by the leadership, often portrays the outside world as irredeemably corrupt, hostile, or doomed, justifying aggressive actions against perceived enemies, former members labeled as traitors, or society at large. In the most extreme cases, this siege mentality, combined with the leader's apocalyptic prophecies or paranoid delusions, can culminate in mass suicide or violent confrontations, presented as a final glorious escape or a necessary sacrifice to achieve a transcendent goal, a horrifying end to their shared delusion. Thus, a terrifying cult is not defined by its peculiar beliefs alone, but by this destructive amalgam: an absolute leader, isolation, systemic exploitation, insidious psychological manipulation, and often a trajectory towards violence or self-annihilation. It is the calculated dismantling of the individual, the profound betrayal of trust, and the potential for extreme, irreversible harm that transforms a group from merely unorthodox into a subject of our somber, quiet study. These are the chilling elements we will keep in mind as we explore specific examples from history's darker chapters in the nights to come. Our quiet exploration of history's darker chapters now brings us to one of the most infamous and chilling examples of a cult's destructive potential: the People's Temple, and its tragic culmination in the remote settlement of Jonestown, Guyana. This story, unfolding primarily in the 1970s, serves as a somber illustration of how utopian dreams, under the sway of an absolute authoritarian leader, can devolve into a nightmare of manipulation, abuse, and ultimately mass death. It begins, as so many such tales do, with a figure of compelling, if ultimately deeply flawed charisma. James Warren Jones, or Jim Jones, founded the People's Temple in Indianapolis, Indiana, in the mid-1950s. In an era marked by racial segregation and social inequality, Jones initially garnered support by preaching a message of racial harmony, social justice, and communal living. He actively welcomed African Americans into his congregation at a time when many churches remained segregated, and he established social programs, including soup kitchens and nursing homes, that appealed to those seeking a more equitable and compassionate society. This early idealism drew many well-intentioned people to his cause. As the temple grew, it relocated in the mid-1960s and then again in the early 1970s, eventually establishing its main headquarters in San Francisco, California, with branches in other cities. Its congregation was notably diverse, comprising individuals from various racial and socioeconomic backgrounds, all drawn by Jones's powerful oratory, his apparent commitment to progressive ideals, and the sense of community and purpose the temple offered. Jones cultivated an image as a benevolent father figure, a protector of the vulnerable, and a champion of a socialist-inspired vision of equality. However, beneath this veneer of progressive activism and communal care, a darker pattern was emerging. Jim Jones increasingly presented himself as a messianic figure, performing staged faith healings and claiming unique spiritual insights. His control over his followers became more absolute, demanding unwavering loyalty and obedience. Members were encouraged, and later often pressured, to donate their possessions and income to the temple, fostering a system of economic dependence. The communal living experiments, while initially appealing to some, also served to isolate members from outside influences and strengthen Jones's authority over every aspect of their lives. The temple's socialist-inspired ideology promised a utopian society free from the racism, poverty, and injustices of the outside world. This vision of creating a rainbow family living in perfect harmony resonated deeply with many who felt marginalized or disillusioned with mainstream American society. The pooling of resources, the collective labor, and the shared sense of building something new and better were powerful motivators, binding the community together under Jones's increasingly singular and unchallengeable leadership. By the mid-1970s, however, the People's Temple began to face mounting scrutiny from former members, concerned relatives, and the media. Allegations of financial irregularities, physical and psychological abuse, and Jones's increasingly erratic behavior started to surface. Faced with this growing pressure and fearing the collapse of his authority, Jones initiated a mass exodus of his followers to a remote agricultural settlement he had established in the jungles of Guyana, South America. This settlement, officially named the People's Temple Agricultural Project, became infamously known as Jonestown. The move to Guyana was presented to followers as an escape from the corruption and persecution of the United States, a chance to build their socialist paradise, a promised land far from the interference of outsiders. For some, the journey was undertaken with genuine hope and idealism, a belief that they were pioneers creating a new and better world. For others, particularly those with deep family ties within the temple, or those already heavily indoctrinated, there was little choice but to follow their leader into the unknown. Life in Jonestown, however, quickly diverged from any utopian dream. While the settlement was carved out of the dense jungle through immense collective labor, the reality was one of hardship, deprivation, and ever-tightening control. Followers worked long hours in the fields and on construction projects, often on insufficient rations. The tropical climate was challenging, and medical facilities were rudimentary. The promise of an agricultural paradise remained largely unfulfilled, with food security becoming a constant concern. Crucially, Jonestown was designed for maximum isolation. Communication with the outside world was strictly monitored and censored by Jones and his inner circle. News from home was filtered or fabricated, letters were read, and contact with relatives was often discouraged or forbidden. This physical and informational isolation was a key tool in maintaining Jones's psychological dominance, preventing members from gaining any objective perspective on their situation or learning about the growing concerns for their welfare back in the United States. Jim Jones' behavior in Jonestown became increasingly paranoid and tyrannical. He fostered an atmosphere of constant fear, warning of imminent attacks by external enemies such as the CIA, mercenaries, or concerned relatives he branded as traitors. Armed guards patrolled the settlement not just for defense against these imagined threats, but also to prevent members from escaping. Loyalty was constantly tested, and any sign of dissent or questioning of Jones's authority was met with severe punishment. These punishments ranged from public humiliations and beatings to sensory deprivation in coffin-like boxes and threats against family members. Jones, increasingly reliant on drugs, would deliver rambling, hours-long sermons over the settlement's loudspeaker system, often late into the night, depriving residents of sleep and further disorienting them. He orchestrated White Night rehearsals, drills for mass suicide, conditioning his followers to accept the idea of revolutionary death as an act of ultimate loyalty and defiance against a hostile world. Psychological manipulation was pervasive. Jones referred to himself as dad or father, positioning himself as the sole protector and provider for his children. He skillfully exploited their fears, their hopes, and their dependencies. The us versus them mentality was relentlessly reinforced, making the outside world seem terrifying and Jonestown the only safe haven, however grim its reality had become. For many, their individual identities had been subsumed by the collective, their critical faculties eroded by years of indoctrination and the relentless pressure to conform. In November 1978, driven by mounting reports of human rights abuses from concerned relatives and former members, United States Congressman Leo J. Ryan led a delegation, including journalists and family members, to Jonestown on a fact-finding mission. Initially, they were presented with a carefully staged facade of a happy, thriving community. However, during the visit, a number of Jonestown residents secretly passed notes to Ryan's group expressing their desire to leave. As Ryan's delegation prepared to depart with these defectors from the nearby Port Kaituma airstrip on November 18, 1978, they were ambushed and attacked by gunmen sent by Jim Jones. Congressman Ryan, 3 journalists, and one of the defectors were murdered in the assault. Several others were wounded. This act of violence against a U.S. official and members of the press signaled the point of no return for Jones and sealed the fate of Jonestown. Back in the settlement, as news of the airstrip attack reached him, Jim Jones initiated his final, horrifying plan. He gathered his followers in the central pavilion and, in a chilling address broadcast over the loudspeakers and captured on audio tape, convinced or coerced them into committing what he termed revolutionary suicide to protest the perceived evils and conspiracies of the outside world. He told them that their enemies would soon descend upon them, and that death was their only honorable escape. Vats of grape-flavored drink laced with a deadly cocktail of cyanide, sedatives, and tranquilizers were prepared. The final moments, as gleaned from the audio tape and the few survivors who managed to escape into the jungle, were a chaotic and heartbreaking scene of coercion, resistance, and resignation. Children were poisoned first, often administered the lethal mixture by their own parents, under duress, their cries a haunting backdrop to Jones's final, chilling exhortations. Many adults, though clearly terrified and some audibly protesting, were pressured by armed guards and the overwhelming psychological force of Jones's will and the group's desperate dynamic. Others, deeply indoctrinated and believing this to be a necessary, even transcendent act, went to their deaths more willingly. In the space of a few short hours, over 900 people, including more than 300 children, lay dead. Jim Jones himself died from a gunshot wound believed to be self-inflicted or by a close aide. The aftermath was a scene of almost unimaginable horror, a field of bodies surrounding the pavilion, a testament to the absolute power one individual had gained over the lives and deaths of so many. The poisoned utopia of Jonestown became a global symbol of the terrifying potential of cults, a grim warning about the dangers of charismatic leaders who demand absolute devotion, the seductive allure of simplistic solutions to complex problems, and the catastrophic consequences of unchecked power and blind faith. The story of the People's Temple and Jonestown serves as a deeply unsettling reminder of the characteristics we discussed earlier: an absolute authoritarian leader, profound isolation from outside society, the exploitation of followers, pervasive psychological manipulation, and ultimately, a horrifying propensity for violence and self-destruction. It is a somber chapter in history, one that quietly underscores the vulnerability of the human mind and the devastating cost when utopian ideals are twisted into instruments of death. Following our somber reflection on the tragic events of Jonestown, our journey into the shadowy world of terrifying cults now leads us to a group whose path to self-destruction was paved with a unique blend of apocalyptic prophecy, New Age spiritualism, and a profound belief in salvation from outer space. We turn our quiet attention to Heaven's Gate, a group whose final, chilling act in the late 1990s captivated and horrified the world, offering another stark example of absolute leadership and the ultimate abandonment of earthly existence. The origins of Heaven's Gate can be traced to the early 1970s in the United States, with the fateful meeting of two individuals, Marshall Herf Applewhite, the former university music professor with a complex personal history, and Bonnie Lou Nettles, a nurse with a keen interest in biblical prophecy, theosophy, and extraterrestrial visitation. Together they developed a unique and evolving theology, eventually presenting themselves as extraordinary beings, messengers from a higher realm, sometimes referred to as the two or Do and T figures foretold in the book of Revelation, destined to lead a chosen few to salvation. Their core teaching centered on the idea that planet Earth was a kind of spiritual garden or classroom, a place where souls could be cultivated and prepared for graduation to a higher state of being, a physical realm in deep space they referred to as the next level, or quite literally, the kingdom of heaven. They believed that individuals who followed their teachings could overcome their human nature and evolve into new, incorporeal beings ready to ascend to this celestial paradise aboard a spacecraft piloted by advanced extraterrestrials. In the mid-1970s, Applewhite and Nettles, then sometimes known as Bo and Peep, began attracting their first followers, traveling across America and holding meetings to share their otherworldly message. They appealed to individuals seeking spiritual answers, a sense of purpose, or an escape from what they perceived as a corrupt and decaying human society. The group went by various names during its formative years, including Human Individual Metamorphosis, and more simply the UFO group, reflecting its central preoccupation with extraterrestrial saviors. Life within the group, which they often termed the classroom, was characterized by a gradual but total disengagement from earthly life. New members were required to shed all vestiges of their former identities. They abandoned their families, friends, careers, and possessions. They were given new androgynous names and encouraged to adopt a uniform, gender-numeral appearance, often involving short haircuts and loose-fitting clothing. This was all part of the process of overcoming their humanness and preparing for the supposed metamorphosis into next-level beings. The leadership of D.O., Applewhite, and T.I. was absolute and unquestioned. Their teachings, a complex and ever-shifting amalgam of biblical interpretations, science fiction tropes, and New Age concepts, formed the unquestionable truth around which all life in the group revolved. They dictated every aspect of their followers' existence, from diet and daily schedules to personal thoughts and relationships. Individuality was suppressed in favor of a collective consciousness, all focused on the singular goal of graduation. The group maintained a nomadic existence for many years, moving from place to place, often living in campsites or rented houses, which further reinforced their isolation from mainstream society and deepened their dependence on the leaders. They developed a highly structured, almost monastic lifestyle, with strict rules governing behavior, communication, and even emotional expression. Human desires, particularly sexuality, were seen as significant impediments to spiritual progress and had to be rigorously controlled and, if possible, entirely eliminated. Bonnie Nettles, T., passed away from cancer in 1985. Her death posed a significant theological challenge as she was supposed to have physically ascended with Applewhite. However, Applewhite adeptly reinterpreted this event, claiming that T had merely shed her earthly vehicle and had already transitioned to the next level, where she was now assisting him from a higher plane. This event solidified Applewhite's singular leadership and perhaps intensified the group's focus on the physical body as a mere temporary container. Following T's death, Applewhite, or Do, continued to refine the group's doctrines. The idea of a physical spaceship arriving to collect them became more prominent. He taught that to be eligible for this celestial departure, members had to achieve a state of complete detachment from all human impulses, including their gender identity and sexual urges. This led to one of the group's most extreme practices, the voluntary castration of several male members, including Applewhite himself, as a radical means of eradicating sexual desire and achieving a purer, more evolved state. The group became increasingly insular, though in their later years they paradoxically embraced modern technology, using the burgeoning internet to disseminate their teachings and even attract new followers through their website. They supported themselves through a web design business called Higher Source, their clean-cut professional demeanor belying the increasingly bizarre and extreme nature of their underlying beliefs and the profound level of control exerted by Applewhite. As the 1990s progressed, the anticipation of their graduation intensified. Applewhite began to link their departure to specific celestial events. The arrival of the Hale-Bopp comet in 1996 and 1997 became the focal point of their final preparation. Heaven's Gate members came to believe that a massive spacecraft, their long-awaited transport to the next level, was concealed in the comet's luminous tail, sent by TI to collect her faithful students. This belief provided the catalyst for their final, tragic act. Convinced that the window for their departure was imminent and that they needed to shed their earthly vehicles or containers to rendezvous with a spaceship, the group began meticulous preparations for a collective exit. They recorded hours of farewell messages, calmly explaining their beliefs and their reasons for leaving, their faces often serene, their convictions seemingly absolute. In late March 1997, in a rented mansion in Rancho Santa Fe, California, 39 members of Heaven's Gate, including Marshall Applewhite, methodically took their own lives. The suicides were carried out in carefully planned stages over several days. Members ingested a lethal mixture of phenobarbital mixed with applesauce or pudding, followed by vodka, and then placed plastic bags over their heads to ensure asphyxiation. They were found dressed in identical dark tracksuits and brand new Nike sneakers, each with a $5 bill and some quarters in their pockets, and a purple shroud covering their faces and torsos. The scene discovered by authorities was orderly, almost eerily peaceful, yet profoundly disturbing. It was the quiet, methodical culmination of over 2 decades of indoctrination, isolation, and an unshakable belief in a reality entirely divorced from the outside world. They did not see their actions as suicide in the conventional sense, but as a necessary and joyful graduation, a transition to a higher state of existence aboard an alien spacecraft. The Heaven's Gate tragedy sent shockwaves across the globe, raising anew difficult questions about the nature of belief, the power of charismatic leaders, and the vulnerabilities that can lead individuals to embrace such extreme and self-destructive ideologies. It highlighted how a search for meaning, transcendence, or escape from worldly troubles could, under specific conditions of isolation and manipulation, lead to a complete abandonment of self-preservation. The group's extensive use of the internet to explain their philosophy and document their final intentions left behind a chilling digital archive, a window into a closed world where logic was inverted and an extraordinary celestial event was interpreted as a personal summons to an otherworldly destiny. The comet, a beautiful and inspiring sight for most of humanity, became for them a harbinger of their chosen end. Heaven's Gate stands as a stark example of how the characteristics of a terrifying cult, absolute authoritarian leadership, profound isolation, the dismantling of individual identity, and an all-consuming reality-defining belief system, can lead to a conclusion that is both bizarre and deeply tragic. The image of those 39 individuals, willingly leaving their earthly containers in pursuit of a spaceship hidden behind a comet, remains a somber and unsettling testament to the profound power of such groups. Their story, like that of Jonestown, reminds us that the journey into the abyss of a cult often begins with seemingly innocuous steps, with promises of enlightenment, community, or a better world. It is only gradually, through carefully orchestrated control and manipulation, that the path narrows, options disappear, and the unimaginable becomes not only possible, but, in the minds of the devout, entirely necessary. The comet's call for the members of Heaven's Gate was a siren song leading to a final, silent departure. Our quiet journey through the unsettling landscape of terrifying cults now takes us to Japan, and to a group that in the late 20th century demonstrated a horrifying capacity for violence not just against its own members, but against the wider public. Aum Shinrikyo, meaning supreme truth, under the guidance of its charismatic and deeply disturbed leader, Shoko Asahara, evolved from an esoteric spiritual group into a doomsday cult armed with weapons of mass destruction, culminating in an act of indiscriminate terror that shocked the world. Shoko Asahara was born Chizuo Matsumoto in 1955 in rural Japan. Partially blind from infantile glaucoma, he reportedly harbored ambitions for power from a young age. After failing to enter prestigious universities, he turned his attention to alternative medicine, acupuncture, and various spiritual disciplines, including yoga and esoteric Buddhism. In the mid-1980s, he founded Aum Shinrikyo, initially presenting it as a yoga and meditation center that offered paths to spiritual enlightenment and improved health. Asahara cultivated a powerful and enigmatic persona. He claimed to have achieved supreme enlightenment after travels in India, and asserted he possessed extraordinary spiritual powers, such as levitation, clairvoyance, and the ability to transmit spiritual energy to his disciples. He presented himself as a savior, a modern-day enlightened master who held the keys to escaping the suffering of the material world and achieving a higher state of consciousness. This message initially found a surprisingly receptive audience. The appeal of Aum Shinrikyo in its early days was diverse. It attracted not only individuals seeking spiritual meaning or healing, but also highly educated young people, including scientists, engineers, and students from elite universities. Many were disillusioned with the perceived materialism and spiritual emptiness of modern Japanese society and found Asahara's promise of a profound truth and a clear path to salvation compelling. The group grew rapidly, establishing communes and businesses and amassing considerable wealth. However, as Aum Shinrikyo expanded, so did Asahara's control and the increasingly extreme nature of its ideology. The group evolved into a rigidly hierarchical organization, with Asahara at its apex, demanding absolute obedience and veneration from his followers. His teachings became a complex and often contradictory blend of elements drawn from Tibetan Vajrayana Buddhism, Hinduism, with a particular focus on Shiva, the destroyer and recreator, Christian apocalyptic prophecies from the Book of Revelation, the writings of Nostradamus, and various New Age and occult beliefs. At the core of Aum's evolving doctrine was a deeply pessimistic and paranoid worldview, centered on the imminent arrival of Armageddon. Asahara prophesied a series of catastrophic global events, including a Third World War, possibly involving nuclear or chemical weapons, which would destroy civilization as it was known. Only the dedicated followers of Aum Shinrikyo, purified through rigorous ascetic practices and unwavering loyalty to Asahara, would survive this apocalypse and play a key role in building a new, utopian world under his enlightened rule. Asahara's own self-perception also inflated dramatically. He began to identify himself with Christ as the Lamb of God and claimed to be Japan's only fully enlightened master, tasked with a divine mission to save humanity, or at least a chosen few. He taught that society was irredeemably corrupt and that external institutions, particularly the Japanese government and a shadowy global conspiracy, were actively trying to destroy Aum and prevent its sacred mission. This fostered a strong us versus them mentality within the group. Indoctrination methods within Aum became increasingly intense and coercive. Members living in communes were subjected to extreme isolation from outside influences, including their families. They endured long hours of meditation, chanting, and listening to Asahara's recorded sermons, often coupled with sleep deprivation and meager diets. Some members were allegedly administered hallucinogenic drugs like LSD to induce visions or spiritual breakthroughs, further blurring the lines of reality and increasing their suggestibility to Asahara's pronouncements. One particularly sinister concept within Aum's teachings was poa, a Tibetan Buddhist term originally referring to the transference of consciousness at the time of death. Asahara twisted this concept, claiming he could transfer good karma to his disciples, or, more ominously, that he could effectively help people, including perceived enemies or wavering members, achieve a better rebirth by ending their current lives, a doctrine that would later be used to justify internal purges and murder. As Asahara's paranoia and apocalyptic fervor grew, so did Aum Shinrikyo's ambition to not merely survive Armageddon, but to actively participate in it, or even to hasten its arrival. The cult began to envision itself as a force capable of confronting and overthrowing the Japanese government and battling the global conspiracies it believed were arrayed against it. Aum started to establish a shadow government structure within its organization, with ministries mimicking those of the state ready to take control after the prophesied collapse. This shift towards militancy saw Aum actively recruiting scientists and engineers, leveraging their skills for a far darker purpose: the development and production of weapons of mass destruction. The group established sophisticated laboratories within its compounds and poured vast financial resources into acquiring materials and expertise to manufacture chemical weapons, most notably sarin and VX nerve agents, as well as attempting to produce biological agents like anthrax and botulinum toxin. They also sought to acquire conventional firearms and even explored avenues for obtaining nuclear technology. The internal regime within Aum became increasingly brutal. Dissent was not tolerated. Members who questioned Asahara, attempted to leave, or were deemed disloyal faced severe punishments, including prolonged confinement, physical abuse, and extreme psychological pressure. There were also credible allegations, later confirmed in court, of Aum members murdering defectors, troublesome outsiders, and even family members of followers who opposed the cult, all under the direct or indirect orders of the leadership. In June 1994, Aum Shinrikyo carried out a trial run of its chemical warfare capabilities. Members released sarin gas in a residential neighborhood in Matsumoto, Japan, in an apparent attempt to assassinate judges presiding over a lawsuit against a cult. 7 people died and hundreds were injured in this precursor attack, though Aum initially managed to deflect blame. This event, however, foreshadowed the far greater horror to come. The terrifying culmination of Aum Shinrikyo's apocalyptic ambitions occurred on the morning of March 20, 1995. During the peak of morning rush hour, 5 Aum members, acting in a coordinated operation, released sarin gas on multiple lines of the Tokyo subway system. They pierced plastic bags filled with liquid sarin using a sharpened umbrella tip, leaving the deadly nerve agent to evaporate and spread through the crowded train cars and stations. The immediate effect was chaos, panic, and widespread suffering. Passengers began choking, collapsing, and experiencing convulsions and vision loss. 13 people ultimately died as a direct result of the attack, and over 6,000 others suffered injuries of varying severity, many with lasting health consequences. The attack paralyzed the world's busiest metropolis and sent a wave of shock and fear across Japan and the globe, demonstrating the horrifying potential of a cult to wage war on civilian society. The motivations behind the Tokyo subway attack remain somewhat debated, but likely included a desire to disrupt ongoing police investigations into Aum's criminal activities, an attempt to fulfill Asahara's apocalyptic prophecies by instigating chaos and societal collapse, or perhaps even a desperate, misguided effort to purify a sinful world or to demonstrate Aum's power. Whatever the precise rationale, it was an act of indiscriminate terrorism, born from a delusional and paranoid worldview. In the aftermath of the attack, an unprecedented nationwide manhunt was launched for Shoko Asahara and the key perpetrators. Extensive raids on Aum compounds uncovered their weapons laboratories, stockpiles of chemicals, and evidence of their vast and sinister operations. Asahara himself was eventually found hiding in a secret chamber within one of Aum's facilities and arrested in May 1995. The trials of Asahara and other Aum leaders were lengthy and complex, revealing the full extent of the cult's crimes, from fraud and coercion to murder and terrorism. Asahara was eventually sentenced to death, and many of his key lieutenants received death sentences or long prison terms. Aum Shinrikyo as an organization was effectively dismantled, though successor groups under different names and supposedly reformed ideologies continue to exist, monitored by Japanese authorities. The story of Aum Shinrikyo serves as a chilling modern example of how a charismatic leader can twist spiritual seeking into a vehicle for absolute power, paranoia, and ultimately mass violence. It underscores the terrifying potential for a cult, armed with a potent apocalyptic ideology and access to scientific knowledge, to pose a profound threat not only to its own members but to the innocent public. The sarin gas attack on the Tokyo subway remains a somber warning from history, a quiet echo of a terror born from the supreme truth. Our quiet examination of history's most terrifying cults now leads us into the turbulent heart of 1960s California, a time of countercultural upheaval, spiritual searching, and profound societal change. It was against this vibrant and often chaotic backdrop that one of the most notorious and fear-inducing cult figures of the 20th century emerged, Charles Manson. With his manipulative charisma and a bizarre apocalyptic vision, he gathered a group of devoted followers known as the Manson Family and orchestrated a series of brutal murders that shocked a nation and forever tainted the image of an era. Charles Manson himself was a product of a deeply troubled and unstable upbringing. Born in 1934, his early life was marked by neglect, poverty, and a string of incarcerations for various petty crimes, escalating to more serious offenses. By the time he was released from prison in 1967, at the height of San Francisco's Summer of Love, he was a seasoned manipulator, skilled at reading people's vulnerabilities and exploiting their desires for belonging and meaning. He was a small, wiry man with intense eyes and a capacity for both disarming charm and sudden, unnerving shifts in mood. The late 1960s provided fertile ground for a figure like Manson. Disaffected young people, many from middle-class backgrounds, were flocking to centers of counterculture like Haight-Ashbury, seeking alternatives to mainstream society, experimenting with drugs, and exploring unconventional spiritual paths. Manson, with his guitar, his rambling philosophical pronouncements, often a garbled mixture of Scientology, esoteric Christianity, and his own idiosyncratic notions, and his air of a street-smart guru, proved adept at attracting a coterie of followers, particularly young women. He preyed on their insecurities, their alienation from their families, and their yearning for acceptance and a sense of purpose. He offered them a seemingly non-judgmental community, a family where they felt understood and loved, at least initially. He presented himself as a Christ-like figure, a misunderstood visionary who possessed profound insights into the nature of reality and the coming societal collapse. His early followers saw him as a charismatic leader, a musician, a poet, and a prophet. The group that coalesced around him became known as the Manson Family. They lived a nomadic existence at first, drifting between various locations in California, often squatting or relying on the charity of others. Their lifestyle was a rejection of societal norms, characterized by communal living, free love, though often manipulated by Manson for his own ends, and the heavy use of hallucinogenic drugs, particularly LSD. Manson frequently controlled the administration of these drugs, using them as a tool to break down his followers' inhibitions, alter their perceptions of reality, and solidify his own influence over their minds. As the family grew, they eventually settled in more isolated locations, most notably Spawn Ranch, an old movie set near Los Angeles, and later, Barker Ranch in Death Valley. This physical isolation was crucial for Manson's control. It cut his followers off from outside influences, from family and friends who might question his authority, and from any news or information that contradicted his increasingly bizarre pronouncements. Their world became entirely centered on Manson and the group's internal dynamics. Within this closed environment, Manson's control became absolute. He employed a range of psychological manipulation techniques, including love bombing, public shaming, sleep deprivation, and constant indoctrination through his rambling lectures, which he called raps. He systematically undermined his followers' sense of individual identity, often giving them new names, denigrating their past lives and family connections, and fostering a complete emotional and psychological dependence on him. He was their father, their lover, their guru, their god. Sexual dynamics within the family were complex and exploitative. Manson encouraged promiscuity and group sex, presenting it as a means of breaking down hang-ups and achieving spiritual liberation. But he largely controlled these encounters, using sex to reward loyalty, punish dissent, or bind new members to the group. He maintained a harem of devoted female followers, while the male members often occupied a lower, more subservient status, their loyalty also fiercely tested. It was in this isolated, drug-fueled, and highly controlled environment that Manson began to develop and preach his apocalyptic prophecy, which he dubbed Helter Skelter. He obsessively interpreted lyrics from the Beatles' White Album, particularly the song Helter Skelter, along with passages from the Book of Revelation, as foretelling an imminent bloody race war. He claimed that black people would rise up and slaughter the white establishment in a wave of horrific violence. According to Manson's prophecy, he and his chosen family would be spared this carnage. They would retreat to a mythical, bottomless pit in Death Valley, where they would wait out the apocalypse. After the black population had, in Manson's racist and delusional view, proven incapable of governing themselves following their supposed victory, they would turn to Manson and his family to lead them, making him the ruler of the New World Order. This bizarre and terrifying vision became the central motivating ideology of the group. Manson believed that this apocalyptic race war needed a catalyst, a spark to ignite the flames. He grew frustrated that Helter Skelter was not beginning as he had prophesied. He decided that he and his family would have to show Blackie how to do it, to commit a series of shocking, brutal murders that would be blamed on black militants, thereby triggering the racial Armageddon he so fervently anticipated and desired. His followers, by this point deeply indoctrinated and terrified of displeasing him, became his willing instruments. In August 1969, Manson unleashed his reign of terror. On the night of August 8th, he dispatched 4 of his most devoted followers, Charles Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian, who would later become a key witness for the prosecution, to a house at 10,050 Cielo Drive in Benedict Canyon, Los Angeles. The house was then occupied by actress Sharon Tate, who was 8.5 months pregnant, and her husband, director Roman Polanski, who was away in Europe at the time. Answer: family members brutally murdered Sharon Tate along with 3 of her friends who were present: celebrity hairstylist Jay Sebring, coffee heiress Abigail Folger, and Folger's boyfriend Wojtek Frykowski. Also killed was Stephen Parent, a young man who was visiting the property's caretaker. The victims were shot and stabbed multiple times in a frenzy of violence. The word pig was scrawled in blood on the front door, a deliberate attempt to implicate black revolutionaries. The following night, August 9th, Manson, dissatisfied with the perceived sloppiness of the Tate murders and wanting to be more directly involved, accompanied a group of followers including Watson, Atkins, Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten as they randomly selected another house. They chose the home of supermarket executive Leno LaBianca and his wife Rosemary, in the Los Feliz neighborhood of Los Angeles. Manson initially entered the house and tied up the couple before leaving his followers to carry out the murders. Leno and Rosemary LaBianca were also brutally stabbed to death. Words such as rise, death to pigs, and Helter Skelter, misspelled, were written in blood on the walls and refrigerator. The sheer arbitrary brutality of the crimes, coupled with the cryptic messages, spread terror and confusion throughout Los Angeles and beyond. The seemingly idyllic freewheeling counterculture of the 1960s seemed to have birthed something monstrous and inexplicable. The subsequent investigation was complex, but eventually, breakthroughs including confessions from some family members led to the arrest of Manson and his key followers. The trial that followed in 1970-71 was a media circus, a bizarre spectacle that exposed the inner workings of the Manson family, their strange beliefs, their absolute devotion to Manson, and the chilling details of the murders. Manson, ever the performer, carved an X, later a swastika, into his forehead and often disrupted the proceedings with outbursts and pronouncements. Ultimately, Charles Manson and several of his followers were convicted of the Tate-LaBianca murders and sentenced to death, though these sentences were later commuted to life in prison when California abolished the death penalty. The Manson family, as an active cult, was effectively dismantled, but its name became synonymous with the darkest aspects of cult behavior: charismatic manipulation, ideological extremism, and shocking, senseless violence. The story of the Manson family serves as a chilling case study in how a manipulative individual, preying on the vulnerabilities of others and fostering an environment of isolation and dependency, can twist ideals of love and freedom into instruments of hate and murder. Helter Skelter never came, but the terror Charles Manson and his followers unleashed left an indelible scar on the American psyche, a somber reminder of the terrifying potential lurking in the shadows of even the most hopeful and idealistic of times. Their acts were a horrifying perversion of the peace and love ethos, a dark mirror reflecting the anxieties and fractures of an era. Our quiet journey into the more unsettling corridors of history now leads us to a compound outside Waco, Texas, in the early 1990s. Here, a religious community known as the Branch Davidians, under the charismatic and controversial leadership of a man named David Koresh, found itself at the center of a tragic and deeply divisive confrontation with federal law enforcement. The events that unfolded at their Mount Carmel center would culminate in a devastating fire and a significant loss of life, leaving behind a legacy of grief, recrimination, and enduring questions about faith, control, and state power. The Branch Davidians were not a new group, having originated as a schism from the Seventh-day Adventist Church in the 1930s. They were rooted in a tradition of biblical literalism, apocalyptic prophecy, and the belief in continuing divine revelation through chosen messengers. For decades, they had lived a relatively quiet, communal existence at their Mount Carmel property, awaiting the fulfillment of scriptural prophecies regarding the end times. The dynamic of the community, however, began to change significantly with the arrival and eventual ascendancy of a young man named Vernon Wayne Howell. Born in 1959, Howell had a difficult and unconventional upbringing. He possessed a keen intelligence, a remarkable memory for biblical scripture, and a burgeoning musical talent, but struggled with dyslexia and dropped out of high school. In the early 1980s, he arrived at Mount Carmel and quickly immersed himself in the Branch Davidian community, impressing many with his fervent piety and his seemingly profound understanding of the Bible, particularly its more obscure prophetic passages. Through a combination of charisma, intense biblical exposition, and a series of internal power struggles, Vernon Howell gradually consolidated his influence within the community. By the late 1980s, he had effectively taken control, ousting previous leaders. In 1990, he legally changed his name to David Koresh, David, signifying his perceived lineage from the biblical King David, and Koresh being the Hebrew name for Cyrus, the Persian king, prophesied to facilitate the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem, a figure Koresh saw as a type for his own messianic role. Koresh's appeal to his followers was multifaceted. He was a compelling speaker, capable of holding his audience rapt for hours with intricate, though often idiosyncratic, interpretations of Scripture. He promised his followers unique spiritual insights, a special understanding of God's plan for the end times, and a place among the saved when the prophesied apocalypse arrived. He fostered a powerful sense of belonging and purpose within the isolated community, positioning himself as their divinely appointed shepherd and protector. At the core of Koresh's theology was his claim to be a modern-day messianic figure, the Lamb of God, spoken of in the book of Revelation, who alone possessed the ability to unlock the meaning of the seven seals and guide his flock through the tribulations that would precede Christ's second coming. His teachings became increasingly focused on an imminent violent apocalypse which he believed the Branch Davidians were destined to play a central role in, and for which they needed to be spiritually and, as it would emerge, physically prepared. Life at the Mount Carmel Center under Koresh's leadership became increasingly regimented and centered entirely around his authority and interpretations. Daily existence often involved long hours of labor on the compound, communal meals, and most importantly, extensive Bible study sessions, which were essentially lengthy monologues by Koresh, dissecting scripture in minute detail and reinforcing his own prophetic significance and the group's unique status as God's chosen people. Koresh exerted profound control over nearly every aspect of his followers' lives. He dictated diets, work assignments, and social interactions. Most controversially, he radically reshaped marital and sexual relationships within the community. He taught that he was divinely ordained to take multiple spiritual wives from among the female members, including, according to testimonies from former members and official investigations, underage girls. Existing marriages within the group were often dissolved, and other men were expected to remain celibate, while Koresh claimed these new light relationships were necessary for procreating a lineage of future rulers in God's coming kingdom. The community became increasingly insular, with limited contact with the outside world. Koresh fostered a deep suspicion of external authorities and societal norms, portraying the Babylonian world outside Mount Carmel as corrupt and hostile to their divine mission. This isolation, combined with his constant scriptural exegesis, created a powerful echo chamber where his teachings were rarely questioned and his authority became virtually absolute in the minds of his most devoted followers. As part of their preparation for the prophesied apocalyptic confrontation, the Branch Davidians began stockpiling firearms and ammunition. Koresh taught that they would need to defend themselves during the end-times battle foretold in Scripture. While some weapon ownership was legal, reports from concerned former members and relatives alleged that the group was illegally modifying weapons to be fully automatic and was amassing an arsenal far beyond any reasonable need for self-defense, raising alarms with federal authorities. These allegations, particularly concerning illegal firearms and disturbing claims of child abuse within the compound, led to an investigation by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, ATF. Believing they had probable cause, the ATF planned a dynamic raid to serve search and arrest warrants at the Mount Carmel Center. On the morning of February 28, 1993, a large contingent of ATF agents attempted to execute this raid. The initial raid quickly devolved into a chaotic and deadly firefight. Accounts differ as to who fired the first shot, but gunfire erupted from both sides. 4 ATF agents were killed, and more than a dozen others were wounded. Inside the compound, at least 5 Branch Davidians were killed in this initial exchange, and several others, including Koresh himself, were injured. The failed raid marked the beginning of a tense and protracted standoff. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, quickly took command of the situation, establishing a perimeter around the Mount Carmel Center and initiating what would become a 51-day siege. The events at Waco became a media spectacle, broadcast live around the world as authorities attempted to negotiate a peaceful resolution with Koresh and his followers, who were now heavily armed and barricaded inside their sprawling wooden complex. Negotiations were fraught and complex. Koresh, often communicating through telephone calls and recorded messages released to the media, engaged in lengthy theological discourses, reiterated his prophetic claims, and made various promises to surrender that were often delayed or rescinded. The FBI employed a range of tactics, including playing loud music and sounds, cutting off electricity at times, and maintaining a constant, visible, armed presence, all aimed at increasing pressure on those inside to give up. Some members, including a number of children, were released during the siege, but the majority remained. As the siege wore on, concerns grew within the FBI about the conditions inside the compound, the potential for mass suicide given Koresh's apocalyptic beliefs and previous statements, and the psychological state of both Koresh and his followers. Believing that negotiations had reached an impasse and that those inside were in increasing danger, authorities made the fateful decision to end the standoff by force. On the morning of April 19, 1993, the FBI began a final assault, using armored combat engineering vehicles to puncture holes in the walls of the compound and insert tear gas, with the stated aim of forcing the Branch Davidians out. For several hours, tear gas was pumped into the buildings. Then around midday, fires broke out almost simultaneously in several parts of the complex. Fanned by strong winds, the flames quickly engulfed the largely wooden structures. The origin of the fire remains one of the most contentious aspects of the Waco siege. The official government investigation concluded that the fires were deliberately set by Branch Davidians as part of a mass suicide plan or in an act of defiance. However, some survivors and critics have argued that the fires could have been accidentally ignited by the FBI's actions, such as the tear gas canisters or the impact of the vehicles, or that the Davidians did not intend for the fire to become an uncontrollable inferno. The result was an immense tragedy. Approximately 76 branch Davidians, including more than 20 children, David Koresh himself, and several of his key lieutenants, perished in the flames or from gunshot wounds, some of which were determined to be self-inflicted or mercy killings. Only a handful of individuals managed to escape the inferno. The siege, the fire, and the high death toll sparked years of intense debate, recrimination, and numerous investigations. The Waco siege remains a deeply polarizing event in American history. Competing narratives persist. One portrays the Branch Davidians as a dangerous, heavily armed cult led by a manipulative madman who was abusing children and planning violence, justifying the government's intervention. Another depicts a misunderstood religious community exercising their right to freedom of belief, who were unfairly targeted and ultimately destroyed by excessive and unwarranted government force. The truth, as is often the case in such complex tragedies, likely contains elements from various perspectives. Regardless of one's interpretation, the events at Mount Carmel in 1993 serve as a somber and disturbing chapter in the study of cults, state power, and religious freedom. It highlights the profound dangers that can arise when a charismatic leader with an apocalyptic worldview gains absolute control over an isolated community, and the tragic potential for miscalculation, escalation, and immense loss of life when such groups come into conflict with the outside world. The ashes of Waco left behind not just physical ruin, but a haunting legacy of unanswered questions and enduring sorrow. Our quiet exploration of history's more disturbing phenomena now leads us to a secretive and enigmatic group that emerged in Europe and North America in the latter part of the 20th century, the Order of the Solar Temple. This organization, with its blend of esoteric traditions, apocalyptic prophecies, and promises of cosmic transit, ultimately led its followers down a path of ritualized death, leaving behind a trail of bewilderment and tragedy across several countries. Its story is a somber reminder of how the search for enlightenment can be twisted into a justification for the unthinkable. The Order of the Solar Temple, or OTS, was formally founded in 1984 by two key figures, Joseph DiMambro and Luc Jouret. DiMambro, born in 1924, was the elder, a shadowy and manipulative figure with a long history in various esoteric and Rosicrucian-inspired groups. He was often seen as the true power behind the throne. The ideological architect and financial controller, Jouret, born in 1947, was a charismatic Belgian homeopathic doctor, a compelling public speaker who delivered lectures on alternative health, spirituality, and the coming age of Aquarius, effectively serving as the order's primary recruiter and public face. Initially, the OTS presented itself as an exclusive, neo-chivalric order, claiming spiritual lineage from the medieval Knights Templar. It promised its members spiritual advancement, access to hidden esoteric knowledge, and a path to prepare for a coming era of global transformation. The order established branches in Switzerland, France, and particularly in Quebec, Canada, attracting a diverse following that often included wealthy, educated individuals, professionals, business people, and those drawn from New Age and alternative spiritual circles. The belief system of the Order of the Solar Temple was a complex and syncretic tapestry, woven from various threads. It incorporated elements of Templar mythology, Rosicrucianism, Hermeticism, and a strong dose of New Age mysticism, including beliefs in reincarnation, ascended spiritual masters, and astral travel. Crucially, a potent strain of apocalyptic environmentalism ran through their teaching, and they preached that planet Earth was facing imminent ecological catastrophe and spiritual pollution, and that humanity was on the brink of a devastating global crisis. From this impending doom, however, there was a promised escape, but only for a select, enlightened few. This escape was termed the transit, a core doctrine of the OTS. Followers were taught that through purification, adherence to the order's teachings, and ultimately a departure from their earthly existence, they could journey to a higher dimension or another celestial body, often associated with the star Sirius. This transit was frequently linked to fiery symbolism, a cleansing passage to a renewed and eternal life, far from the corrupted and dying earth. Life within the order was characterized by strict hierarchy and elaborate secret rituals. DiMambro and Jouret sat at the apex of this structure, revered as enlightened masters or even as reincarnations of significant historical figures. Members participated in ceremonies often involving elaborate robes, swords, and mystical symbols, designed to reinforce their sense of belonging to an elite spiritual cadre. DiMambro, a skilled manipulator, reportedly used theatrical tricks, including projections and sound effects, to stage apparitions of spiritual masters and divine beings during these rituals, further cementing his authority and the belief in the order's supernatural connections. Financially, members were often encouraged, if not pressured, to donate substantial sums of money, property, and assets to the order. These funds ostensibly supported the group's activities, communes, and preparations for the transit, but also contributed to the lavish lifestyles of its leaders, particularly Demambro. This financial exploitation, coupled with the intense psychological control, created a powerful dependency among the followers, binding them ever tighter to the order's dictates. As the years passed, internal pressures and Demambro's increasing paranoia began to create cracks within the seemingly serene facade of the Solar Temple. Questions arose among some members regarding Demambro's financial dealings, the authenticity of his spiritual claims, and the increasingly authoritarian and erratic nature of his leadership. Those who voiced doubts or attempted to leave were often branded as traitors or Judases, perceived as threats to the purity and sacred mission of the order. This created an atmosphere of suspicion and fear within the group. Demambro, in particular, became obsessed with perceived betrayals and external enemies. He believed the order was being persecuted by government agencies and that the prophesied apocalyptic deadline was fast approaching. His pronouncements grew more urgent and more extreme. One of a series of disturbing internal events that signaled a darker turn was the ritualistic murder of a 3-month-old baby in Moraine Heights, Quebec, in early October 1994. The infant, the son of 2 cult members, was stabbed to death with a wooden stake because Demambro had allegedly identified him as the Antichrist, sent to destroy the order's mission. This horrifying act was a prelude to the first wave of mass deaths that would bring the Order of the Solar Temple to global infamy. On October 4th and 5th, 1994, a series of interconnected tragedies unfolded. In a farmhouse in Chieri, Switzerland, 23 people were found dead, many apparently from poison or gunshots, their bodies arranged in a star formation, dressed in ceremonial robes. The farmhouse was then set ablaze. On the same day, in 2 chalets in Salvan, Switzerland, another 25 bodies were discovered, also victims of a combination of murder and suicide, with the chalets subsequently burned. Among the dead in Switzerland were Joseph Demambro himself and Luc Jouret, their own transit seemingly orchestrated alongside those of their most devoted followers. Evidence suggested a carefully planned operation involving sedatives, plastic bags used for suffocation, and gunshots to ensure death before the fires consumed the sites. Letters left behind spoke of escaping the hypocrisies and oppression of this world and making a journey to a higher plane of existence. Simultaneously, across the Atlantic in Moraine Heights, Quebec, the bodies of 2 more individuals connected to the cult, including one of the parents of the murdered infant, were found in a burned-out chalet, linking the tragedies on both continents. The initial belief was that the leaders had orchestrated these events and perished with their followers, perhaps signaling the end of the order. However, the horror was not yet over. Just over a year later, in December 1995, another grim discovery was made. 16 bodies were found, arranged in a star formation, in a clearing in the Vaucours Mountains, near Grenoble, France. They had been shot and their bodies burned in another ritualistic mass death. Most of the victims were French and Swiss members of the OTS, indicating that the order, or at least a faction of it, had survived the 1994 events and remained committed to the doctrine of transit. The final act in this tragic saga occurred in March 1997 in the small town of Saint-Casimir, Quebec. 5 more members of the Order of the Solar Temple took their own lives in a house that was then set on fire. They left behind messages indicating their belief that they were departing to join their spiritual family on a journey to a higher dimension, timed to coincide with what they believed were significant celestial or spiritual events. This brought the total death toll associated with the OTS to 74 people. The series of mass suicides and murders associated with the Order of the Solar Temple were driven by a potent combination of apocalyptic fears, esoteric beliefs in a cosmic transition, and the absolute manipulative control exerted by its leaders. Followers were convinced that the world was irredeemably corrupt and doomed, and that their only salvation lay in a radical, fiery departure from their physical existence. The transit was presented not as an end, but as a glorious beginning, a journey to a place of light and purity. The letters and documents left by OTS members often expressed a profound disillusionment with the material world, a weariness with its perceived injustices and spiritual emptiness, and a fervent hope for a transcendent escape. They saw themselves as elite souls, modern-day Knights Templar, embarking on a final sacred voyage. The tragedy lies in how this yearning for meaning and transcendence was twisted by manipulative leaders into a death pact. The blurred lines between suicide and murder within these events remain a disturbing aspect. While some members appear to have willingly participated in their own deaths, others, including children, were clearly victims of murder, dispatched before the ritual conflagration. This highlights the extreme level of coercion and the devaluation of individual life that can occur within such closed, high-demand groups. The Order of the Solar Temple stands as a chilling example of how a blend of grandiose esoteric claims, charismatic leadership, financial exploitation, and apocalyptic paranoia can lead to horrific outcomes. It demonstrates that terrifying cults are not confined to any single ideology or demographic, but can emerge from various spiritual traditions, attracting educated and affluent individuals who are nonetheless vulnerable to sophisticated manipulation and the seductive promise of secret, ultimate truths. The ashes of their chalets and the silence of their final resting places serve as a somber, quiet warning. Our quiet exploration of groups that exert extraordinary control over their followers now leads us to the Holy Spirit Association for the Unification of World Christianity, more commonly known as the Unification Church, or often, colloquially, the Moonies. While perhaps less overtly associated with the kind of violent ends that mark some of the cults we have discussed, the Unification Church, under its founder Sun Myung Moon, became a global phenomenon renowned for its intense indoctrination methods, its societal impact, and its highly controversial practices, particularly the mass wedding ceremonies. It offers a different yet equally compelling study in the insidious nature of psychological and social control. Sun Myung Moon was born in what is now North Korea in 1920. According to his own accounts, at the age of 15, he had a profound religious experience in which Jesus Christ appeared to him, revealing that Moon was chosen to complete Jesus' unfinished mission on earth, to establish the physical kingdom of heaven and restore humanity to a state of perfection. This divine calling, he claimed, set him on a path to become a new Messiah, a true parent for all humankind. After periods of imprisonment and hardship in North Korea, Moon made his way to South Korea, where he formally founded the Unification Church in Seoul in 1954. The core teachings of the church were laid out in a text called the Divine Principle, which presented a unique and complex reinterpretation of the Bible. It taught that God's original plan for creation had been corrupted by the fall of Adam and Eve, and that history was a long struggle by God to restore humanity. Jesus had attempted this restoration but was crucified before he could marry and create a perfect family. Thus, a new Messiah, a Lord of the Second Advent, was needed to fulfill this mission. Sun Myung Moon unequivocally identified himself as this new Messiah, the true father, and his wife Hak Ja-han as the true mother. Together, they were the true parents, destined to create a sinless lineage and guide humanity towards global unity and peace under their spiritual and implicitly temporal leadership. This message, offering clear answers to life's big questions, a path to salvation, and a vision of a harmonious world, proved attractive to many, initially in post-war Korea, and later on a much larger international scale. The Unification Church began its global expansion in the late 1000s, 950s, sending missionaries to Japan, and then, most significantly, to the United States in the early 1970s. It was in America that the church gained widespread public attention and a significant number of converts, particularly among idealistic young people, college students, and those searching for spiritual meaning or a strong sense of community during a period of social and cultural upheaval. The church often used front groups and outreach programs to attract potential recruits. Recruitment into the Unification Church typically involved an invitation to attend introductory lectures or weekend workshops, often held in pleasant, welcoming environments. Here, potential members were introduced to the divine principle through carefully structured seminars. A key element of this initial engagement was a technique often described by former members and researchers as love bombing, an intense, overwhelming display of affection, acceptance, and unconditional positive regard from existing church members, making newcomers feel uniquely valued and understood. Once individuals became more involved, the indoctrination process intensified. Residential workshops lasting for days or even weeks would immerse recruits in the Unification Church's theology and worldview. These often involved long hours of lectures, group discussions, chanting, singing, and communal activities, frequently coupled with limited sleep and a controlled diet. This environment was designed to break down old patterns of thought and instill a new unificationist identity, centered on absolute faith in and obedience to Reverend Moon as the Messiah. A critical aspect of this indoctrination was the gradual isolation of members from their previous lives. Contact with biological families, friends, and other outside influences was often discouraged, reframed as connections to a fallen world that could hinder their spiritual progress. Members were taught to see the Unification Church as their new true family, with Sun Myung Moon and Hak Ja-han as their true parents, to whom their primary loyalty was owed. This separation caused immense distress and conflict for many families of members. Financial exploitation was another significant and controversial feature of life within the Unification Church. Members were expected to dedicate themselves fully to the church's mission, which often meant surrendering their personal assets, tithing a significant portion of any income, and, most visibly, engaging in tireless fundraising activities. For years, Moonies were a common sight on city streets, selling flowers, candles, ginseng tea, or other products for long hours, with the proceeds going to support the church's expanding global operations and Moon's increasingly lavish lifestyle. This was often framed as indemnity, a way for members to atone for past sins and contribute to world salvation. Furthermore, many members worked for little or no pay in the numerous businesses owned and operated by the Unification Church, which grew into a vast international conglomerate with interests in manufacturing, shipbuilding, media, including the Washington Times newspaper, real estate, and many other sectors. This dedicated, unpaid, or poorly paid labor force contributed significantly to the church's immense wealth and global influence. Control over the personal lives of followers was extensive. Beyond their finances and labor, the church, through Moon's teachings and the guidance of elder members, often influenced diet, daily schedules, social interactions, and even intimate thoughts and feelings. Members were taught to report on each other for any perceived lack of faith or deviation from doctrine, creating an atmosphere where constant vigilance and conformity were paramount. The ultimate goal was the complete subjugation of the individual will to the will of the true parents and the Unification movement. Perhaps the most distinctive and publicly recognized practice of the Unification Church was its mass wedding ceremonies, known as blessing ceremonies. In these extraordinary events, Reverend Moon would personally match thousands of couples, often from different countries and cultural backgrounds, who had sometimes never met before the matching or the wedding itself. These couples were then married simultaneously in vast stadium gatherings, dressed in identical wedding attire. The theological significance of these blessing ceremonies was profound within Unification doctrine. They were seen as the primary means by which perfected families, free from original sin, could be created, forming the foundation of the future kingdom of heaven on earth. By being matched and blessed by the true parents, members believed their lineage was purified and their children would be born sinless, contributing to the restoration of humanity. This practice, however, also represented an ultimate form of control by Moon over the most personal and intimate decisions in his followers' lives. The pressure to participate in the blessing and to accept the spouse chosen by Moon was immense. For devoted members, it was a sacred duty and a path to salvation. For outsiders, however, these mass weddings often appeared as a bizarre and disturbing manifestation of cultic control, raising concerns about coercion, the nature of consent, and the future well-being of these instantly formed cross-cultural unions. Many of these marriages endured, while others faced significant challenges or eventually dissolved. The Unification Church, throughout its history, faced numerous accusations of brainwashing, financial impropriety, and deceptive recruitment practices, leading to widespread public suspicion and numerous legal battles. Sun Myung Moon himself was convicted of tax evasion in the United States in the 1980s and served time in federal prison, an event his followers portrayed as persecution akin to that faced by Jesus. Despite these controversies, the Unification Church built a global empire and exerted influence in various political and social spheres. Its members often displayed remarkable dedication, driven by a sincere belief in Moon's messianic claims and the promise of a unified world under divine guidance. The insidious nature of the control exerted lay not necessarily in overt physical violence, but in the sophisticated and systematic manipulation of fundamental human needs for love, belonging, purpose, and spiritual meaning. Sun Myung Moon passed away in 2012, leaving behind a complex and contested legacy. The Unification Church, now led by various members of his family, continues to exist, though it has faced internal divisions and a decline in membership in some regions. Its story remains a powerful case study in the dynamics of charismatic leadership, the formation of new religious movements, and the fine, often blurred line between devout faith and destructive cultic behavior. The Unification Church, with its global reach, its mass weddings, and its profound impact on the lives of its adherents, exemplifies a type of cult where control is meticulously woven into the very fabric of belief and community. It demonstrates how an ideology promising utopia and personal transformation can lead individuals to surrender their autonomy, their resources, and even their most personal choices to a leader perceived as divine, highlighting the quiet yet deeply impactful ways in which minds can be ensnared. Our quiet exploration of groups that exert terrifying control over their members now brings us to a more recent and insidious example, one that operated not in a remote jungle or under the banner of overt religious prophecy, but under the polished veneer of a self-help organization and executive coaching enterprise. We turn our attention to NXIVM, a group that, from the late 1990s until its dramatic downfall around 2018, ensnared thousands, including some high-profile individuals, in a complex web of psychological manipulation, financial exploitation, and, in its darkest inner circles, shocking abuse. NXIVM was co-founded in 1998 by Keith Raniere, a man who presented himself as a polymath, a child prodigy with an exceptionally high IQ and a visionary thinker, alongside Nancy Salzman, a psychiatric nurse who became his devoted second-in-command and was known within the organization as Prefect. Their flagship offering was Executive Success Programs, or ESP, a series of expensive workshops and seminars that promised to unlock human potential, eradicate limiting beliefs, and foster personal and professional growth through a supposedly scientific methodology termed rational inquiry. The initial appeal of NXIVM was carefully cultivated to attract intelligent, ambitious, and often idealistic individuals. They targeted professionals, entrepreneurs, artists, and those genuinely seeking self-improvement and a greater sense of purpose. The language used was often that of empowerment, ethical living, and building a better, more noble world. Raniere, though often remaining somewhat in the background in the early days, was positioned by his inner circle as the vanguard, the brilliant mind behind these transformative teachings. Newcomers were typically introduced to NXIVM through an initial 5-day intensive workshop, which could cost thousands of dollars. This served as an entry point into a tiered system of further courses, programs, and intensives, each more expensive and demanding greater commitment than the last. This structure itself was a form of gradual ensnarement, drawing participants deeper into NXIVM's unique culture, jargon, and worldview, often before they fully realized the extent of the control being exerted. The indoctrination methods employed by NXIVM were sophisticated and insidious. Seminars involved long hours, often leading to sleep deprivation. Teachings were repetitive, and a specific vocabulary was used to redefine concepts and control thought. Terms like stripe path for personal progress, EMS, or explorations of meaning for guided psychological probing, and suppressives for critics or those deemed negative influences. A culture of intense self-scrutiny and confession, often in group settings, was fostered, making members vulnerable and dependent on NXIVM coaches for validation. Psychological manipulation was central to NXIVM's operations. Keith Raniere's teachings, often delivered through Nancy Salzman or other high-ranking members, encouraged followers to view him as the ultimate authority on ethics, human behavior, and spiritual growth. Doubt or criticism of Raniere or his methods was systematically reframed as a personal ethical breach, a sign of one's own disintegration or evidence of being influenced by suppressive persons. This effectively shut down critical thinking and reinforced. Isolation from external criticism was another key element. Members were often discouraged from discussing NXIVM's teachings with outsiders, particularly with family or friends who expressed skepticism. Negative media reports or testimonies from former members were dismissed as the work of suppressives, trying to undermine Raniere's noble mission. This created an echo chamber where NXIVM's reality became the only accepted truth, further entrenching members within its ideological confines. Financial exploitation was pervasive. The escalating cost of courses placed a heavy burden on many members, some going into significant debt to continue their strife path. There was constant pressure to recruit new members as NXIVM operated on a multi-level marketing model. Furthermore, many dedicated followers worked long hours for NXIVM-affiliated organizations for little or no pay, believing they were contributing to a world-changing movement, while resources often flowed upwards to support Raniere and the NXIVM leadership. As individuals became more deeply involved, the control tightened. Raniere's influence extended into the most personal aspects of his followers' lives, including their careers, relationships, and even their diets. He cultivated an inner circle of devoted women, some of whom lived with him or were in intimate relationships with him, further solidifying his power and mystique within the organization. His pronouncements, however strange or demanding, were to be accepted as profound wisdom. The most horrifying aspect of NXIVM's operations remained hidden from all but a select few until much later. This was a secret society within NXIVM known as Dominus Obsequious Sororium, Latin for Master over Obedient Female Companions, often referred to simply as DOS, or The Vow. It was presented to potential recruits by high-ranking female NXIVM members as an exclusive women's empowerment group, a secret sorority designed to help them overcome their weaknesses and achieve greater strength and liberation. The reality of DOS, however, was far more sinister. It was a pyramid scheme of masters and slaves, with Keith Raniere positioned unseen at the absolute apex. Women recruited into DOS were required to provide collateral, deeply compromising personal information. nude photographs, signed confessions to fabricated crimes, or even rights to family assets. This collateral was intended to ensure their absolute obedience and silence, as its release would be devastating. Once initiated, slaves were expected to serve their masters, who were themselves slaves, to higher-ranking women, all ultimately subservient to Raniere. This servitude included performing menial tasks, adhering to extremely restrictive diets to achieve Raniere's preferred slender physique, being available 24/7 for their master's demands, and crucially recruiting more women to become slaves beneath them. One of the most shocking practices within DOS was the ritualistic branding of its members. Women were told they would receive a small tattoo as a symbol of their commitment. Instead, without their full and informed consent regarding the nature of the mark, they were held down and cauterized with a branding iron, creating a scar in their pelvic area that, unbeknownst to many of them initially, incorporated Keith Raniere's initials, or a combination of his and high-ranking DOS master Allison Mack's initials. This was, in effect, a mark of ownership. Furthermore, DOS slaves were groomed and coerced into sexual servitude for Keith Raniere. Under the guise of spiritual growth, overcoming their issues with sex or fulfilling a higher purpose, women were expected to be sexually available to him. The power dynamics, the collateral, and the years of psychological manipulation rendered any notion of true consent meaningless. It was a system designed for Raniere's sexual exploitation and gratification, hidden behind layers of esoteric justification and secrecy. The involvement of high-profile individuals, including actresses like Allison Mack, known for her role in the television series Smallville, who became a prominent recruiter and master within DOS, and wealthy heiresses, lent NXIVM an air of legitimacy and glamour that helped to attract more followers and deflect criticism for a time. These endorsements made it harder for outsiders and even some insiders to believe the darker rumors that occasionally surfaced. The unraveling of NXIVM began in earnest when several courageous former members, including DOS slaves, began to speak out, providing detailed and harrowing accounts of their experiences. Investigative journalism, most notably a 2017 expose in the New York Times, brought NXIVM's abuses and particularly the existence of DOS and the branding to widespread public attention. This triggered intense scrutiny from law enforcement agencies. In 2018, Keith Raniere was arrested in Mexico. Subsequently, Nancy Salzman, Allison Mack, and other key figures within the NXIVM leadership were also arrested and faced a range of serious federal charges. Raniere was ultimately convicted on charges including racketeering, sex trafficking, forced labor conspiracy, and wire fraud, and was sentenced to 120 years in prison. His top lieutenants received varying sentences for their roles in the criminal enterprise. The NXIVM case stands as a stark modern illustration of how the appealing facade of self-help and personal empowerment can be used to mask a deeply manipulative and exploitative cultic structure. It highlights the sophisticated techniques of psychological grooming, the insidious power of collateral in ensuring silence and obedience, and the devastating impact such groups can have on the lives of their members. The quiet promise of a better self in NXIVM led many down a path to unimaginable abuse and loss of autonomy, a chilling reminder that the search for meaning can sometimes lead into the darkest of places. Chapter: The Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Polygamy and Abuse. Welcome. Our focus shifts to a group tracing roots to 19th century Mormonism, yet forging extreme isolation, the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, FLDS. This offshoot, breaking from mainstream LDS, which discontinued polygamy in 1890, clung to plural marriage as a divine command. Residing in secluded communities in Utah, Arizona, and later Texas, the FLDS developed a society where doctrine dictated all life, leading to systemic abuse under autocratic rule. The most notorious figure to dominate the FLDS was Warren Steed Jeffs. Following his father Rulon Jeffs' death in 2002, Warren swiftly consolidated power, claiming the prophet's mantle, Earth's sole conduit for God's will. This ascent wasn't just administrative, it was a divine appointment demanding absolute obedience. His leadership style was an iron fist, intensifying restrictive practices and expanding his authority to unprecedented levels within the insular group. As self-proclaimed prophet, Warren Jeffs wielded absolute control. His words were God's direct revelations. Overriding personal desires or laws, he dictated marriages, reassignment of wives and children, employment, housing, and minute daily conduct from dress to recreation. Disobedience meant sinning against God, risking eternal damnation and temporal punishment like expulsion from family, a fate many feared above death. Central to FLDS theology was plural marriage, believed essential for highest salvation. This wasn't mere custom but a core religious duty, especially for men aspiring to leadership. Warren Jeffs taught that a man's number of wives and children directly correlated with heavenly glory. This doctrine created immense pressure to conform and gave Jeffs enormous power, as he alone determined who married whom and how many wives were assigned. Spiritual marriages under Jeffs took a sinister turn with systemic marriage of underage girls to older men. These unions with girls as young as 12 were presented as divine pairings for spiritual benefit. In reality, they constituted statutory rape and child abuse on a massive scale. The girls, raised in complete subservience and taught obedience to the prophet was paramount, had no agency to refuse, groomed from birth for this fate. The FLDS established isolated communities, notably Hilldale, Utah, and Colorado City, Arizona, Short Creek, and later the Yearning for Zion, YFZ Ranch, in Texas. This deliberate seclusion minimized outside scrutiny, reinforced group cohesion, and made it easier for leaders like Jeffs to control information and daily lives. Within these enclaves, external laws were secondary to the prophet's directives, creating closed systems where abuses flourished unchecked. Psychological abuse was rampant and systemic in FLDS communities. Indoctrination began at birth. Children learned Jeffs was God's mouthpiece and the outside Gentile world was wicked. Education was controlled, ceasing for girls young, focusing on religion and preparation for marriage. Individuality was suppressed, critical thinking forbidden, and pervasive fear of prophet, divine retribution, expulsion ensured compliance and discouraged dissent. Sexual abuse was intrinsic to the FLDS system under Jeffs, linked to polygamy with minors. Young girls with little understanding of sex were forced into marriages and sexual relations with older men, including Jeffs himself, who had dozens of wives. These were not isolated acts, but part of a religiously sanctioned structure, normalizing female exploitation. The trauma was profound, compounded by victims' isolation and community denial or justification. Warren Jeffs and FLDS leaders maintained strict economic control. Property and businesses were often held under a communal church trust, the United Effort Plan, UEP, before state seizure. Members worked for church businesses for little/no pay, consecrating labor. This financial dependence solidified Jeffs' control, as individuals lacked resources and feared being cast out. Wealth often funded leadership's lavish lifestyles and power consolidation. A cruel practice under Warren Jeffs was expelling young men and boys, the Lost Boys. Justified by minor infractions, many believe the motive was reducing competition for brides, ensuring older, loyal men had more wives. Cast out with no money, little education, and no understanding of the outside world, these young men faced immense hardship, often homelessness or severe trauma from the total loss of their families and community. Life for FLDS women and girls was extreme subjugation with minimal autonomy. Their primary purpose, per doctrine, was obedient wife and mother, producing many children for God's and their husbands' glory. Dress codes enforced modest prairie-style dresses. Hair was in intricate updos. Access to education, outside information, and independent decision-making were severely restricted. Constant surveillance and threat of reassignment ensured compliance. Despite FLDS secrecy, cracks appeared. Stories from apostates, escapees, and lost boys reached media and law enforcement, painting a disturbing picture. Early investigations were hampered by community non-cooperation, fear, and complex legal challenges. However, the volume of allegations, particularly of underage marriage and abuse, drew more focused and sustained attention from state and federal authorities, signaling a shift. A pivotal moment was the April 2008 raid on the Yearning for Zion Ranch in Texas. Prompted by a call alleging abuse of underage girls, authorities took over 400 children into protective custody. While the initial call was later deemed a hoax by some, conditions found evidence of underage marriages and abuse, provided grounds for legal action, and brought FLDS practices under intense national and international scrutiny. Before the YFZ raid, Warren Jeffs became a fugitive. In May 2006, he was on the FBI's 10 most wanted list for arranging illegal underage marriages. Captured in August 2006 near Las Vegas after a traffic stop, his initial Utah trials for rape as an accomplice saw convictions later overturned. However, evidence gathered paved the way for robust prosecutions in Texas, where YFZ evidence was most potent and damning. The legal tide turned decisively against Warren Jeffs in Texas. In 2011, he was convicted on 2 felony counts of sexual assault of a child for spiritual marriages to a 12-year-old and 15-year-old. He received life in prison plus 20 years. Subsequent appeals by Jeffs and loyalists largely failed. His imprisonment marked a significant blow to FLDS leadership, though he reportedly continued to exert influence from prison for some time. Warren Jeffs' imprisonment fractured the FLDS community, now facing immense challenges. Some remained loyal, while others left or questioned leadership. State intervention, like the UEP trust takeover and property redistribution in Short Creek, altered power dynamics. Numerous survivors shared harrowing stories seeking justice and healing. These accounts raised public awareness and provided crucial evidence against other abusive sect leaders. The FLDS under Warren Jeffs is a grim testament to absolute religious authority's devastating potential when combined with isolation and systemic suppression of rights. The deep psychological, sexual, and economic harm inflicted on thousands, particularly children and women, will resonate for generations. Its legacy underscores protecting vulnerable populations, ensuring access to education and outside information, and challenging ideologies justifying abuse in faith's name. Its history is a somber lesson on cultic controls, dark extremes. Welcome. Our examination of troubling groups now turns to one with a controversial and damaging legacy concerning children. The Children of God, later the Family, and currently the Family International, originating in 1968 in Huntington Beach, California, amidst counterculture fervor. It was founded by David Brandt Berg, initially a radical Christian ministry for hippies. Its doctrines evolved, disturbingly, leaving a profound traumatic imprint on those raised within its isolated, controlled communal system. At the heart of the Children of God was its charismatic, authoritarian founder, David Berg, titled Moses David, Mo or Dad. He communicated his voluminous, evolving teachings via Mo letters, directives members had to obey. Berg portrayed himself as God's end-time prophet, demanding absolute loyalty. His writings became ultimate authority, shaping life, thought, and most controversially, sexual conduct within the group's communes across the globe. Initially, the Children of God attracted disillusioned youth with messages of spiritual revolution, communal living, and rejecting the system. Early colony kids engaged in zealous street evangelism and lived communally, pooling resources. This period showed fervent, if unconventional, Christian fundamentalism. Berg's leadership, however, soon steered the group to unorthodox scripture interpretations and his own divine authority, isolating members. A pivotal problematic doctrine by David Berg was the law of love. Berg taught God's love transcended all other laws, including traditional societal and even biblical injunctions against certain sexual acts. This he interpreted to mean sex, in almost any form between consenting group members, was permissible and an expression of God's love. This shift laid groundwork for practices bringing condemnation and trauma, especially concerning children. One notorious practice from the law of love was flirty fishing, FFing, religious prostitution. Female disciples, sometimes males, were instructed by Berg to use sexual intimacy to attract new converts, mainly men, and solicit funds. These fishermen and fisherwomen were told they were winning souls for Jesus and fulfilling God's will. This practice for over a decade exposed members to risks and psychological distress under a divine guise. The impact of flirty fishing on adult members was complex, often devastating. Some embraced it as revolutionary evangelism, but many suffered STDs, unwanted pregnancies, emotional turmoil, and exploitation. The doctrine demanded suppression of personal jealousy or discomfort, reframing them as selfishness or faithlessness. Constant pressure to perform, with internal surveillance, created coercion and manipulation, eroding individual boundaries and self-worth. Children born or raised in the Children of God, SGAs to survivors, were viewed as a special end-time army. Their upbringing was dictated by Berg's teachings. From a young age, they were deemed miniature adults spiritually, capable of understanding and partaking in the group's religious and sexual practices. Childhood innocence, as understood externally, was dismissed or reinterpreted through Berg's law of love and as deeply sexualized theology. Indoctrination of COG children was intense, isolated in communes with limited contact with the systemite world depicted as corrupt. Their education was Berg's Mo letters, COG comics, and censored scripture. Critical thought was discouraged. Absolute obedience to Berg and adult leaders was paramount. This created a closed ideological loop, making it hard for children to develop independent perspectives or question norms. Tragically, David Berg's evolving sexual doctrines led to systemic child sexual abuse in the Children of God. Berg issued writings explicitly encouraging sexual interaction between adults and children, and among children, framing these as love and overcoming hypocritical taboos. These teachings, spread through communes, created an environment where predatory behavior was tolerated, sometimes encouraged, leading to widespread trauma for countless young victims. Berg's teachings promoted a loving Jesus revolution, which desensitized children to sex early on and often encouraged their active sexual expression. Children were exposed to adult sexuality in communal living and in many documented cases groomed for and subjected to sexual abuse by older children and adults. Lines between affection, religious instruction, and sexual exploitation were deliberately blurred, leaving children scarred. Life for COG children was often instability, deprivation, and lack of basic safeguards. Due to the group's nomadic ways and system, suspicion, formal education, and consistent healthcare were frequently inadequate or absent. Children were expected to work, including street begging or selling literature from a young age. The communal environment, purportedly loving, could be chaotic and neglectful, with little protection from the insidious harmful doctrines. Facing external pressure, media exposes, and internal dissent on child abuse and flirty fishing, the Children of God rebranded several times. In the late 1970s, it became the Family of Love, then the Family, later the Family International TFI. These changes often coincided with PR efforts to downplay past abuses and present a reformed image. Critics argue core damaging ideologies and authoritarian structures persisted. David Berg died in seclusion in 1994. His second wife, Karen Zerbe, Maria Fontaine or Mama Maria, assumed leadership. Under Zerbe, the Family International evolved. While some explicit sexual practices like flirty fishing and overt child-adult sex as policy were officially altered, Berg's teachings and authoritarianism remained influential. The organization emphasized a new start, but struggled to address deep past wounds. Long-term trauma for second-generation adults, SGAs from Children of God / the Family International, is profound. Many suffer complex PTSD, depression, anxiety, relationship difficulties, and challenges integrating into mainstream society after leaving. The legacy of sexual abuse, emotional manipulation, educational neglect, and isolation left lasting scars, requiring extensive therapy and support for many survivors to rebuild their shattered lives. Survivor activism has been crucial in exposing the Family International's abuses. Former members, especially SGAs, bravely shared stories via books, documentaries, websites, and testimonies. Ex-member organizations support those exiting and advocate for accountability. Their collective voice challenged TFI narratives, brought public awareness to harm inflicted, and pressured authorities to investigate and protect children still influenced. As of the early 2020s, the Family International operates with smaller, dispersed membership. The organization maintains an online presence, claiming reform of past controversial practices. However, it faces scrutiny from survivors and watchdog groups regarding its handling of past abuse allegations, current child protection policies, and the enduring impact of David Berg's doctrines on remaining members and their children. Full accountability is contentious. The Children of God / the Family International's history shows how charismatic leaders can twist love and spirituality into tools of control and exploitation. The profound multi-generational trauma inflicted, especially on children knowing no other reality, highlights such environments' devastating long-term consequences. For survivors, healing is often lifelong, underscoring society's vital role in protecting children and ensuring religious freedom claims do not shield predatory practices from justice. Welcome. In our previous explorations, we navigated the shadowed corridors of specific groups, examining their histories and impacts. Now, however, we pivot from the particular to the universal, from the narrative to the nascent. This chapter, titled The Psychology of Enslavement, Why Do People Join?, seeks to gently unravel the intricate psychological threads that can lead individuals, often unwittingly, into the embrace of destructive cults. Our purpose is not to sensationalize, but to understand the subtle yet powerful mechanisms at play, the quiet interplay of human need and calculated manipulation that underpins these profound and often tragic journeys into psychological captivity. The question of why someone joins a cult is deceptively complex. It is a path rarely chosen with full awareness of the destination. The individuals who find themselves drawn into such groups are not a monolith. They are not inherently weak-willed, unintelligent, or broken beyond repair. Instead, they are often ordinary people, experiencing common human vulnerabilities at a particular juncture in their lives. The misconception that only a certain type of person is susceptible is a dangerous oversimplification. The truth is far more nuanced, suggesting that under specific conditions, the psychological draw of such groups can be unexpectedly potent for a wide array of individuals. At the forefront of these vulnerabilities is often a profound sense of loneliness. Humans are inherently social creatures, wired for connection and belonging. When this fundamental need goes unmet for extended periods, it can create a painful void. Cults, particularly in their initial stages, are adept at presenting themselves as warm, welcoming communities, offering an immediate sense of family and acceptance. This promise of instant camaraderie, of being seen, understood, and valued, can be an irresistible balm to a soul aching from isolation, making the group appear as a sanctuary in a cold and indifferent world. Hand in hand with loneliness often walks disillusionment. This can manifest as a disillusionment with mainstream society, its perceived superficiality, injustices, or lack of authentic connection. It might also be a disillusionment with traditional religious institutions, which may seem dogmatic, impersonal, or unable to provide satisfying answers to life's deeper questions. For some, the disillusionment is intensely personal, a series of failures, disappointments, or a general sense that their life is not aligning with their hopes or potential. Cults frequently tap into this existing dissatisfaction, positioning themselves as the sole alternative, the pure path in a corrupted world. The human search for meaning is a powerful, often relentless, driving force. Many individuals grapple with existential questions. What is my purpose? How can I make a difference? What is the meaning of life and suffering? Cults often rise to meet this deep-seated yearning by providing seemingly clear, comprehensive, and unequivocal answers. They offer a structured worldview, a defined purpose, and a sense of significance within a grand, overarching narrative. For someone adrift in a sea of ambiguity and uncertainty, the allure of such certainty, however fabricated, can be incredibly strong, offering a comforting framework in a chaotic world. Economic hardship or instability can also render individuals more susceptible. The pressure of financial insecurity, unemployment, or the feeling of being trapped in a cycle of poverty can create immense stress and a desperate desire for solutions. Some cults explicitly promise material prosperity, miraculous financial turnarounds, or access to exclusive knowledge that will lead to wealth. Others offer a communal living situation where basic needs are met, relieving the individual of immediate economic burdens. These promises, especially when delivered with conviction, can feel like a lifeline to those struggling to stay afloat. Times of personal crisis or significant life transitions represent another critical window of vulnerability. The death of a loved one, a painful divorce, the loss of a job, recovery from an illness, or even seemingly positive changes like moving to a new city or graduating from school can leave individuals feeling disoriented, emotionally raw, and in need of support and direction. During such periods, the structured environment and ready-made social network offered by a cult can seem exceptionally appealing, providing a sense of stability and guidance when their personal world feels like it's in turmoil. Furthermore, idealism, the very desire to create a better world and contribute to a higher cause, can paradoxically lead individuals towards destructive groups. Many cults present themselves as altruistic organizations dedicated to humanitarian efforts, spiritual enlightenment, or revolutionary social change. They appeal to an individual's noblest intentions, their yearning to be part of something larger than themselves, that promises to heal the world's ills. The initial message is often one of hope, positive change, and making a tangible difference, cleverly masking the more controlling and exploitative agenda that lies beneath the surface. Once a potential recruit is identified, often through their expressed vulnerabilities, a sophisticated process of psychological manipulation typically begins. One of the most common initial tactics is love bombing. The individual is showered with an overwhelming display of affection, attention, praise, and validation from group members. This intense, flattering focus makes the person feel special, understood, and deeply cared for. It creates a powerful emotional hook, fostering a sense of indebtedness and belonging that makes it harder to question or leave the group later, even when red flags begin to appear. This initial euphoria is a potent form of bait. Following closely or concurrent with love bombing is the process of thought reform, also known as mind control or coercive persuasion. This is rarely a sudden, dramatic event, but rather a gradual, insidious process. It involves systematic indoctrination into the group's ideology, often through repetitive lectures, readings, chanting, or rituals. Information from outside sources is increasingly restricted or reinterpreted through the cult's specific lens. Critical thinking is subtly discouraged, often labeled as negativity, spiritual weakness, or a sign of insufficient commitment to the group's supposedly benevolent goals. Integral to thought reform is the use of loaded language and thought-terminating cliches. Cults often develop their own internal jargon, specific words or phrases that have special meanings within the group. This specialized vocabulary serves to reinforce the group's ideology and create a conceptual boundary between members and outsiders. Thought-terminating cliches are simplistic, definitive statements designed to shut down critical thought or complex discussions. Phrases like, "it's all part of the plan," or "doubt is a sign of weakness," prevent deeper inquiry and reinforce conformity to the group's prescribed way of thinking, making independent analysis difficult. Gaslighting is another profoundly damaging technique employed to gain control. This insidious form of manipulation involves systematically undermining an individual's perception of reality. The cult leader or group members may deny or distort the recruit's experiences, feelings, or memories. They might insist that things the recruit remembers happening never occurred, or that their emotional reactions are inappropriate or exaggerated. Over time, the target of gaslighting begins to doubt their own sanity, memory, and judgment, making them more reliant on the group for their understanding of what is real and true. Isolation is a cornerstone of maintaining control within a cult. This is a multifaceted strategy. Physically, members might be coerced or encouraged to live in communal settings, separate from the outside world. Contact with family and friends who are not part of the group is often systematically discouraged, demonized, or outright forbidden. This emotional and informational isolation serves several purposes. It prevents members from receiving reality checks from trusted external sources. It makes them more dependent on the group for social interaction and information, and it deepens their immersion in the cult's closed system of logic and belief. Charismatic leadership plays a pivotal role in fostering dependency. Cult leaders are often portrayed and portray themselves as infallible, enlightened, or divinely appointed figures possessing unique wisdom or power. Members are encouraged to see the leader as the ultimate source of truth, guidance, and even salvation. This creates a powerful dynamic of dependency, where followers relinquish their personal autonomy and decision-making to the leader. Doubting the leader becomes tantamount to doubting the entire belief system, and one's own chance for whatever the cult promises, be it enlightenment, security, or purpose. Finally, the subtle and sometimes overt use of fear, guilt, and intimidation solidifies the psychological chains. Fear can be instilled through dire warnings about the dangers of the outside world, the catastrophic consequences of leaving the group, or punishment for disobedience, spiritual, social, or sometimes even physical. Guilt is manipulated by constantly reminding members of their past failings before joining the cult, or any perceived lack of total commitment. Intimidation, though not always overt, can be present in the pressure to conform and the implicit threat of shunning or retribution for dissent, ensuring compliance through psychological duress. The journey into a cult is therefore rarely a sudden plunge, but a slow, incremental slide, where initial vulnerabilities are expertly met with calculated techniques of persuasion and control. Each step makes the next one easier, as the individual's critical thinking, personal autonomy, and connection to their former life are gradually eroded. The initial allure of belonging, purpose, or answers slowly transforms into a web of psychological dependency that becomes increasingly difficult to escape. It is a testament to the power of unmet human needs and the sophisticated ways they can be exploited. Understanding these psychological underpinnings is not about assigning blame to those who have been ensnared. Instead, it is about fostering a deeper empathy and a more nuanced awareness of the subtle forces that can shape human belief and behavior. Recognizing the patterns of vulnerability and manipulation is crucial, not only for a dull history for sleep, but for cultivating a more discerning eye in our waking lives, potentially helping to protect ourselves and others from such insidious forms of psychological enslavement. The mind is a complex landscape, and these narratives remind us of its intricate pathways. And so, we arrive at the close of our extended contemplation, entering our final chapter. Conclusion: the enduring shadow of control. Throughout our journey, we have navigated the unsettling landscapes of human history, peering into the mechanics of groups that exert profound and often devastating influence over their adherents. We've sought not to sensationalize, but to understand the quiet undercurrents that allow such phenomena to take root and flourish, often in the most unexpected of places, and amongst the most unsuspecting of individuals. It is a history that whispers warnings, even as we seek rest. These stories, however disturbing they may be in their detail and consequence, serve as potent reminders of the immense power of persuasion. This power in itself is not inherently malevolent. It shapes societies, inspires change, and forges connections. Yet, when wielded without ethical restraint, when charm and charisma become tools for domination rather than genuine upliftment, its potential for harm becomes alarmingly clear. The narratives of terrifying cults are, at their core, studies in the art of influence, taken to its most extreme and manipulative conclusions, often beginning with seemingly innocuous steps. They also cast a stark light on the fragile line that can exist between faith and fanaticism. Faith, in its myriad forms, can be a profound source of comfort, meaning, and moral guidance for billions. However, when belief systems demand the complete suspension of critical thought, when they foster an unyielding us versus them mentality, and when they elevate a leader or doctrine beyond any form of questioning or reproach, the ground becomes fertile for fanaticism. This perilous shift often occurs subtly, a gradual erosion of doubt in favor of a consuming absolute certainty that brooks no dissent. The truly terrifying truth of cults, the aspect that lingers long after the specific names and events fade, isn't solely confined to their overt actions, the sensational headlines, or the tragic outcomes we have touched upon. It resides more deeply in their methodical and chillingly effective ability to dismantle an individual's will, to carefully deconstruct a person's autonomy and sense of self. This process is insidious, a slow siege laid against the fortress of the mind, until the very capacity for independent thought and self-direction is compromised and ultimately surrendered to the group. This surrendered will then paves the way for a collective delusion, a shared reality constructed and maintained by the group, often bearing little resemblance to the world outside its closed borders. Within this bubble, actions that would seem abhorrent or irrational to an outsider can become normalized, even righteous. It is this power to reshape perception and morality on a group scale, replacing individual conscience with a collective script, that so often leads to the profound human tragedies that mark the histories of these organizations. The echo chamber effect becomes all-consuming, reinforcing the manufactured truth. As we reflect upon these narratives, it is essential to remember the silent, often unseen struggles that unfold within the confines of such groups. Beyond the doctrines and the leaders, there are individuals, minds being subtly manipulated, identities being systematically reshaped, and lives being consumed by an ideology that promised salvation or enlightenment, but delivered something far different. These are not abstract historical footnotes, but deeply personal journeys of psychological capture, marked by confusion, fear, and the slow fading of a former self. So as you now prepare to drift further towards sleep, perhaps allow a gentle thought for these silent struggles. Remember the profound human yearning for connection, for meaning, for answers. A yearning that, in certain circumstances, can be steered down such perilous path. Consider the minds that were caught in these intricate webs, not with judgment, but with a quiet understanding of the vulnerabilities that make us human, and how easily they can be preyed upon by those who offer simple solutions to complex sorrows. May your own journey through wakefulness, and indeed into your dreams, be consistently guided by the gentle yet steadfast companions of critical thought and genuine, reciprocal connection. May you find strength in your own ability to question, to analyze, and to seek understanding from a multitude of sources, far from the deceptive and often dangerous siren call of absolute certainty peddled by those who would seek to control rather than to empower. True understanding is rarely found in absolutes, but in nuanced exploration. Thank you for listening with us tonight, for lending your quiet attention to these often somber tales. We hope this exploration into the more shadowed corners of history has been, if not comforting, then at least a thought-provoking companion as you prepare for rest. May your dreams be peaceful, untroubled by the echoes of charismatic leaders and far removed from the unsettling architecture of shadowy compounds. Please sleep well.